60 Minutes Rewind.
Earlier this month, President Trump placed Kevin McAleenan in charge of the Department of Homeland Security. The president fired his previous DHS chief, Nielsen, because he said he wanted to go in a tougher direction. As the new acting secretary, McAleenan is facing the largest wave of illegal crossings at the U.S. Mexico border in a decade. 100,000 migrants were detained just last month. So we went to McAllen, Texas, one of the busiest sections on the border, to see for ourselves. We were surprised how many families were crossing, where they were detained, and how quickly they were released. We asked Secretary McAleenan how he plans to manage the crisis and navigate what may be the most difficult job in Washington.
How do you keep happy a boss who wants to go in a tougher direction when it comes to immigration, but also work with a Congress that has absolutely no incentive to get anything done in this area before the election?
Well, first, I believe you can be tough and compassionate at the same time. I'm going to do what I've always done, give good law enforcement, operational, and policy advice to lawmakers and to policymakers, and that's my intent. I think the ground has shifted in this discussion over the past month. I think the numbers from March, I think more members from Congress coming down and seeing what we're facing at the border, they're realizing that something different is happening with this crisis. It's not manufactured, it's real, and we've got to sit down at a table and talk about ways to solve it.
Acting DHS Secretary Kevin McAleenan says migrants are crossing the border in record numbers because they know they'll be released in the U.S.
If you come now, and if you come as a family or as an unaccompanied child, you will be allowed to stay. You will be released because our court system is so backlogged and our laws prevent effective repatriation, even if there's no right to stay in the U.S.
They know if they come, they're going to be let out the back door.
That's exactly right. And the smugglers are advertising that directly in their hometowns.
There is no shortage of people fleeing poverty and crime who want to take the often dangerous trip. We rode with the U.S. Border Patrol deep in southeast Texas. We saw family after family walking into the U.S. Agent Marcelino Medina asks the migrants if they're okay and points them to where they can turn themselves in to other agents. Further along this dusty stretch of road,
there's a family right there.
He spots a family hiding in the bushes.
¿Todos están bien? ¿Necesitan ayuda?
He asks them if they're okay too, and points the way to where they need to go.
¿Para los Estados Unidos o? ¿Ya andas en los Estados Unidos?
Watch their faces when he tells them they're in the United States.
Okay. Vamos a pasar para allá.
He didn't know where he was.
No. He asked how far to the U.S., right? So we were letting him know he's already here. So that's kind of what brought him to tears. He said he just wanted help.
Last month, a record number of families crossed the border. 53,000 people, most with only what they could carry. The groups we saw all had children. This woman, 8 months pregnant, told us she fled violence in Honduras. She'd been traveling for 15 days.
You're trying to get her a ride?
I wanted to get her a ride, yeah, but they're gonna have to walk it.
There are no border agents available to help her. This 277-mile stretch along the Rio Grande River separates the U.S. from Mexico and is one of the busiest sections for illegal crossings.
Those are the rafts they use right there.
Agents told us they are overwhelmed caring for so many families.
Is this a typical day?
Definitely. You're talking about a sector where recently we've been seeing over 1,000 people a day. And this McAllen station, you see there's some more coming down that way right now.
It never ends.
It doesn't.
Agent Medina takes us into the brush to show us why so many families cross at this particular area of the border.
So once they get here, they're in U.S. territory. This is U.S. territory right here.
Correct. That's the Mexican riverbank. This is the U.S. riverbank.
In some spots, it takes less than 15 minutes for a smuggler to paddle an inflatable raft full of migrants across. Typically, they pay between $3,000 and $9,000 a person.
You got to keep in mind that everybody that comes across, no matter adult, child, they're paying thousands of dollars.
Is it the cartel running this?
This is exactly what it is. This is one of their ways that they make money.
We watched as hundreds of migrants walked from the riverbank about 3 miles to a levee to turn themselves in to Border Patrol. It is orderly and oddly quiet, except for the sounds of the wind and babies crying.
Tell me about your trip here. ¿Cómo fue el viaje?
Very difficult, Julio Cesar told us about his 1,600-mile trip from Honduras. Failed crops and threats of violence led him to escape with his daughter. He said his daughter has some sort of chest infection. He hopes he can get her help. As we were talking, his name was called to get on the bus. This is the beginning of their immigration process. Because they've reached U.S. soil, they are legally allowed to apply for asylum, and most will. But first, they are taken to the McAllen Border Patrol Station to be processed. We were allowed to film inside.
Over there, those are the two cells.
A first for the facility. They wanted us to see how busy they are. It looked like any other jail, except that there were mothers with children peering back at us through the glass. Men are kept separately. Background checks are run and fingerprints are taken. Court dates are scheduled.
How many people would you say are in here right now?
How many people would you say?
We have 551 subjects.
551.
Chief Patrol Agent Rudy Karras says they are struggling to care for the increasing numbers of families.
And what are the agents having to do to deal with this new population that's coming across?
40% of my workforce right now is dedicated to the processing, to the care and feeding, to the hospital watch. So that takes that 40% away from their border security mission.
They're making formula, they're bringing juice. Well, there's a pile of diapers right there.
Yeah, that's what we have to do.
The flood of families comes nearly a year after the White House ended its zero-tolerance policy that led to the separation of thousands of children from their parents. Kevin McAleenan was responsible for enforcing that policy as the head of Customs and Border Protection.
Did you have any regrets about the way that was carried out?
Yeah, I think when you lose a public trust in a law enforcement initiative and you have to recalibrate at the presidential level, that means that wasn't successful.
Looking back on it, did it work?
So the enforcement of the law against parents who violated our border laws and brought children with them was effective. But it didn't work in the sense that we lost the public trust in the implementation of that initiative. And I agreed with the president's decision to stop it.
President Trump has said he's not looking to restart family separations, but he has threatened to completely shut down the border.
In many cases, they put their worst people in the caravan. They're not going to put their best in.
According to the DHS, since October, less than 1% of the migrants who crossed the border had any criminal history. The families we saw were traveling from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, an area of Central America referred to as the Northern Triangle.
Why so many people from this northern triangle of countries?
There's poverty, there's drought that's affected the crop yields. Certainly there are issues with food insecurity. In other parts of Central America, there are still violence issues and gang control issues.
We stopped payment to Honduras, to Guatemala, and to El Salvador. We were paying them tremendous amounts of money.
An estimated $700 million in aid a year aimed at preventing violence and curbing extreme poverty and hunger in those countries.
He said, we're not paying them anymore because they haven't done a thing for us. You've testified in Congress we need to continue to support those areas. Do you still believe that?
So I think the president's right that we need to have aid that has a targeted impact. It needs to support American interests. It needs to support economic development, and it needs to help reduce the causes of migration, everything from insecurity on the food side to security in terms of the cities and gang issues.
But wouldn't it just push more people to the border if there's no aid coming in?
Well, aid that's not being used effectively by an accountable partner isn't helping.
The story will continue after this.
We must address the root causes of why these families are coming. I don't think that if they had given a choice, they would come.
Sister Norma Pimentel runs the Catholic Charities Respite Center in McAllen. The Border Patrol has nowhere to take the families after they're released from custody. Luckily, Sister Norma welcomes them all. They are free to go wherever they like, but most stay here for a few days. They are exhausted from weeks of travel and hungry. Volunteers hand out donated clothes and meals.
How many meals are you doing a day in here?
Well, thousands of meals, because we may have like 300, 400, sometimes up to 600, people we feed in on that day. Buenos dias.
Sister Norah took Secretary McAleenan through the respite center. It is noisy and crowded, with more people wanting to come in. Sister Norah says she doesn't turn anyone away.
If you weren't here, where would all these people go?
They would be in the streets begging and asking for help and exposed to so many people taking advantage of them. It's so sad that people are suffering like they are.
From Sister Norma's, the families go to the bus station.
9:45 de la mañana, Columbus, Ohio, okay?
For some, it was just 3 days ago they crossed the border. They tell us they're headed to places where they have family or cities where they offer free legal help. Catholic Charities gives the migrants signs that say, "Please help me, I don't speak English. What bus do I need to take?"
We saw the migrants leaving Catholic Charities, getting on a bus,
Right.
and going off to different parts of the United States.
Those families are given a court hearing. They're given a date for a court hearing, and that court hearing could be 2 years out, 5 years out for an initial hearing. That's how overloaded the system is at this point.
I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to see them get to the bus station. And I think there's that moment when they leave and you're either going to think, that's great, or this is horrifying.
Yeah, the reality of the system today is very hard to understand. We have agents.
There is a border wall in McAllen, but it's not on the river. At some points, it's miles inland from where we saw the migrants come ashore. Secretary McAleenan says it does slow down drug traffickers and the migrants who are trying to evade capture.
We don't need it everywhere, but we need it in several key places, and the support we're getting to build additional walls is essential.
Secretary McAleenan is also lobbying Congress to change the law so DHS can detain families while they await a decision on their asylum claims.
We've asked Congress to modify that law to allow us to detain families together through a fair, transparent, and expeditious court proceeding. And if they have an asylum claim or a valid right to stay under our laws, they would receive that certainty, and if not, they would be repatriated to their home country.
Keeping families longer would require more facilities, potentially costing billions of dollars.
What about tent cities? Is that on the table?
Tent cities, I think, is a misnomer. For us right now, we are looking at DHS at putting up some soft-sided facilities. In fact,
Isn't that a tent?
it is, sure. It could be a tent, but I want to explain the purpose for it. We just had a bipartisan report from the Homeland Security Advisory Council that looked at the situation we're facing on the border and said you need additional facilities. You need to be able to take families and children out of a Border Patrol station, which is a police station. It's built for single adults who have violated laws, and you need them in a better setting.
One day after our interview, we learned DHS had already broken ground on 2 tent cities in Texas to hold migrants for short-term processing. But concerns linger about whether the Department of Homeland Security should be in the business of holding families in any setting. Last year, despite efforts to treat them, 2 children died in DHS custody.
Are you worried that another child's going to die in custody?
So what I know is our agents and officers are doing everything they possibly can to take care of vulnerable people in our custody. When you're looking at people arriving, sometimes more than 4,000 in a day. So with that level of volume, with children that young, with the weather getting hotter, I'm very concerned we could have another tragedy.
Is it a humanitarian crisis or is it a national security crisis?
It's absolutely both.